My name is Hannah, and at 16 years old, Dad and Stepmom argued over a book club while I cried in pain. 15 minutes later, my spine was injured. Now I'm thriving while they rot in guilt. If you have ever felt betrayed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, let me know where you are watching from. I was helping Dad's new wife, Rachel, set up for her book club meeting when the ladder I was standing on slipped beneath my feet. One moment, I was stringing fairy lights over the living room ceiling, and the next, I was falling backward into the air, arms flailing, attempting to cling on to something. I landed so hard on the hardwood floor that the sound echoed throughout the house, and for a while I couldn't breathe, move, or do anything but lie there, gazing up at the whirling ceiling fan above me. Pain burst up my back and spread through my entire body in waves, causing my eyesight to blur and darken at the corners. Rachel came over and crouched alongside me, wondering if I was all right. But when I tried to respond, nothing came out but a strange gasping sound. I tried to sit up and instantly felt something odd with my back. A grinding feeling caused me to cry out and fall back to the floor. My legs felt odd and tingling, like if they had fallen asleep. And when I tried to move my right leg, it didn't respond as expected. Rachel urged me to keep motionless and took out her phone, and I believe she was phoning 112, but she was really messaging someone. Dad ran in from the garage where he had been working on his car, and his face became white as he saw me lying on the floor. I attempted to tell him that I couldn't feel my legs properly, but the words came out garbled and incorrect. He knelt next to me and inquired what had occurred, to which Rachel responded that the ladder had slipped. Dad began to reach for his phone, and Rachel grabbed his wrist, suggesting we should wait a minute to see if I was seriously injured or simply shaken up. I looked at her in surprise since I was lying on the floor, unable to move my legs, and she wanted to see whether I was really harmed. Dad paused with his phone in his palm, looking between me and Rachel with a troubled face I had never seen before. Rachel started talking in a quiet, soothing manner about how ambulances were costly, how my stepmother was often exaggerated about injuries, and how I could only need a few minutes to recover my breath. She explained that her nephew fell from a ladder last year and appeared to be seriously injured at first, but was all right after resting down for a time. The tingling in my legs was worsening and spreading to my hips, and I could feel worry building in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I gasped out that something was seriously wrong with my back and that I needed care right away. Dad eventually dialed 112, but Rachel put her hand over his phone and suggested we attempt to get me to the sofa first to see if I could walk. She said that if I could move on my own, we'd know it wasn't bad enough for an ambulance. Dad really agreed with her, and they both attempted to assist me sit up. The anguish that went through my spine caused me to scream so loudly that our neighbor's dog began barking. I slumped back onto the floor, screaming and asking them to call for assistance, but Rachel was still talking about how we should wait a few minutes. She continued stating that her book club was starting in less than an hour and that having paramedics there would absolutely destroy the evening she had planned for weeks. Dad was gazing at his phone, then at Rachel, and then at me, and I could see him considering his options, as if this were a tough decision rather than an obvious emergency. The fact that he didn't contact 112 right away as I lay there unable to move my legs properly caused a crack in my chest that had nothing to do with the fall. Rachel advised that instead of calling an ambulance, they drive me to the urgent care clinic, which would be faster, cheaper, and less disruptive to her reading group. She was already looking up the location on her phone as I lay on the floor, attempting to explain that I couldn't move and that something was badly wrong with my spine. Dad felt it was a fantastic idea and began discussing how to get me into the car, entirely ignoring the reality that moving someone with a probable spinal injury without correct precautions may result in lifelong harm. I learned it in health class last semester, but none of them seemed to remember or care about that fundamental safety knowledge. My eyesight was becoming blurry at the edges, and the tingling feeling had crept all the way up to my chest. I was scared that whatever was wrong was growing worse. While they were arguing logistics, Rachel checked her watch and stated that if they were going to transport me to urgent care, they needed to leave immediately, so she could return before her guests arrived. The nonchalant way she stated it, like my probable paralysis was merely an annoying schedule issue, made me understand Dad had married someone who didn't care if I survived or died. I tried again to explain that I needed an ambulance and that you should not move someone who has a back problem, but Dad had previously agreed with Rachel's proposal. He went to park the car in the garage as Rachel hovered over me, explaining that the urgent care clinic was just 10 minutes away and had X-ray machines and everything an emergency room would need. I was weeping and attempting to explain to them that I couldn't physically move my legs, and that this was the type of circumstance in which you should always contact 112, but Rachel kept checking her phone and grumbling about her book group and how much effort she had put into arranging this evening. Dad returned, and they talked about how to raise me, and I screamed at them not to move me because they were going to make things worse, but they didn't listen. Rachel grabbed my arms and Dad grabbed my legs, and as they raised me off the floor, the agony was so great that everything turned white, and I believe I blacked out for a few seconds. When my eyesight cleared, I was being carried into the garage, and the movement sent shivers up my spine with each step. They were able to get me into the back seat of Dad's SUV, where I was weeping and asking them to call an ambulance. Dad started the engine, and Rachel climbed into the passenger seat, directing him to the urgent care facility. Every bump in the road made me scream as anguish spread through my back, and the tingling in my legs worsened with each passing minute. Dad continued encouraging me to hang on and that we'd be there soon, but he was driving at the speed limit and stopping properly at every red light, as if this were a regular trip to the store. I couldn't understand why he wasn't driving faster, running red lights, or doing anything to show he knew how important this was. Rachel was on the phone, emailing her book club friends that she could be a few minutes late, but the meeting was still on. She kept telling Dad that I'd be okay and that they'd get me checked out and back home in no time. The urgent care facility was located in a strip mall beside a dry cleaner and a pizza restaurant. When we pulled into the parking lot, I noticed through the glass that there were at least 6 individuals in the waiting area. Dad parked, and they opened the rear door so I could get out. The procedure of getting me from the automobile to standing made me puke from agony. Rachel looked appalled and moved back to avoid getting anything on her shoes while Dad attempted to hold my weight. My legs wouldn't hold me properly, and I kept buckling, so Dad had to half carry me to the entrance while Rachel walked ahead to unlock the doors. The individuals in the waiting area watched as we walked in, and the receptionist's eyes widened when she noticed me. Dad said that I had fallen off a ladder, damaged my back, and couldn't move my legs properly. And the receptionist instantly replied, "That seemed like something that needed to be seen in an emergency department rather than urgent care." She indicated they weren't prepared to treat potential spinal injuries and that we should have contacted 112 from home. Dad and Rachel exchanged stares, and Rachel began to argue that they could at least take an X-ray to check how terrible it was. The receptionist shook her head, explaining that even if they could take X-rays, they couldn't treat a spinal injury here and would have to send us to a hospital anyhow. A nurse emerged from the rear, looked at me, and inquired how long ago I had fallen. When Dad stated it had been around 15 minutes, her expression changed entirely, and she inquired why they hadn't called an ambulance. Rachel began explaining how she wanted to save the expenditure and thought urgent care would be faster. The nurse interrupted her, explaining that 15 minutes was far too long to wait with a possible spinal injury, and that transferring me without sufficient support may have resulted in irreversible harm. She ordered them to contact 112 straight away and that I should lie flat and immobile until paramedics came. Dad eventually took out his phone and phoned as the nurse helped me lie down on the waiting room floor. She was asking me questions about what I was feeling and where the discomfort was. When I informed her about the sensation in my torso, her countenance became serious. She ordered the other people in the waiting area to allow us some space and found blankets from somewhere to place under my head. Rachel was standing off to the side, looking unhappy, and checking her watch again. I overheard her telling Dad that she would have to cancel her book club after all of this. The paramedics arrived about 6 minutes later, rushing in with a stretcher and equipment. They immediately started asking questions about the fall and the symptoms I was having. When I recounted the tingling and inability to move my legs properly, they exchanged concerned expressions. One of them questioned why Dad had delayed so long to call and why he had relocated me rather than phoning from the scene. Dad began describing Rachel's situation, believing that urgent treatment would be more appropriate. The paramedic cut him off, stating that with the symptoms I was expressing, any delay or inappropriate movement may have catastrophic implications. They fitted me with a neck brace and gently moved me onto a backboard, strapping me down so I couldn't move. The procedure was painful, and I was weeping and apologizing for crying. One of the paramedics kept telling me that I was okay and that we'd arrive at the hospital shortly. They loaded me into the ambulance, and one of the paramedics waited in the back with me while the other drove. As we drove away from the urgent care facility, I heard the siren start up. The paramedic in the back was performing neurological tests on me, instructing me to move various areas of my body and grading my reactions. When I tried to move my toes on my right foot, nothing happened, and I noticed him taking a note on his tablet. He inserted an IV and assessed my vital signs while explaining that we were heading to the regional trauma hospital, which had the top neurosurgery department in the area. The phrase neurosurgery made my stomach plummet, so I inquired whether it meant I required spine surgery. He stated they wouldn't know for sure until we arrived at the hospital and they conducted imaging, but given my symptoms, it was quite possible. Even with the siren sounding, the journey seemed to go on forever. Each bend reminded me of how tied down I was and how little control I had over what was happening to my body. The paramedic continued checking on me and asking questions to keep me awake. I told him about slipping down the ladder and how long it took for someone to call for help. He didn't make any judgments, but I could see his jaw tense when I stated the 15-minute delay. We arrived at the hospital, and I was pushed through the doors into what appeared to be a trauma bay, complete with bright lights and scrubs. Everyone was moving quickly and talking in medical terminology that I didn't understand. Someone ripped off my shirt and began applying electrode stickers all over my chest as another examined my back. A doctor introduced herself as Dr. Williams and stated that they would perform a CT scan of my spine to see what was injured. She asked me the same questions regarding my sensations and movements. When she used a gadget to test my feet's reflexes, one responded, but the other did not. Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her exchange a look with one of the nurses. They took me down the hall to a room with a giant machine and carefully placed me on the scanning table. The technician said that I needed to remain totally motionless and that the equipment would emit loud noises. The scan only took around 8 minutes, but it seemed like a lifetime lying there, unable to move and wondering what they were seeing in those photos of my spine. After the scan, they brought me to what the nurse referred to as the neuro ICU. Dad and Rachel arrived around 25 minutes later, and I could hear them arguing in the corridor before they entered my room. Dad was saying something about Rachel's book club not being significant, and she was stating that she had planned it for weeks and couldn't just cancel. When they eventually entered, Rachel remained near the entrance while Dad approached my bedside, looking scared and guilty. He began apologizing and said he should have dialed 112 straight immediately, and I simply gazed at him, unable to believe he was apologizing for something that might have permanently incapacitated me. Dr. Martin presented me with the CT results and indicated that I had shattered vertebrae in my lower spine, as well as severe spinal cord edema. She explained that the swelling was pinching the nerves that controlled my legs, which caused the weakness and numbness. She indicated I required surgery within the next several hours to fix the fracture and alleviate pressure on my spinal cord, and that the delay in treatment had exacerbated the edema. Dad's face turned pale, and he inquired whether the delay meant lasting damage. Dr. Williams stated that it was too early to tell, but every minute of pressure on the spinal cord raised the likelihood of lasting nerve damage. She needed Dad to sign consent documents for the procedure, and she needed them completed right now since time was important. Dad's hands shook as he signed the paperwork, while Rachel remained standing by the door checking her phone. Dr. Williams glanced at Rachel and asked if she had any questions regarding the operation, but Rachel simply nodded her head and stated she was certain everything would be okay. The doctor's look indicated that she had thoughts about Rachel's level of concern, but she kept them professional and stated that the surgical team was getting prepared right now. 2 orderlies entered and began releasing my bed wheels, prepared to carry me to the surgery room. Dad took my hand and told me he loved me and that I will be fine, and I wanted to trust him, but I couldn't stop thinking about how he had prioritized Rachel's book group over my safety. They brought me down to the surgery floor and into a prep area where an anesthesiologist introduced himself and described the operation. He claimed they'd put me under general anesthesia so I wouldn't feel or remember anything about the procedure. A nurse began administering drugs through my IV and informed me that I would become drowsy shortly thereafter. When I asked her what would happen if the operation didn't succeed, she gripped my hand and assured me that the physicians here were the greatest, and that I was in excellent hands. The last thing I remember before I went under was being carried into a bright white operating room full with equipment and masked people staring down at me. Someone ordered me to count backward from 10, and I got to around 6 before everything went dark. When I awoke, I was in a different room with a raw throat and an extremely dry mouth. There was a tube down my neck, and I began to panic and tug on it, but my hands were bound, and nurses hurried over to advise me to be quiet. One of them said that I was still intubated because they wanted to put me on the ventilator for a few more hours to ensure my condition was stable. Later that evening, the tube was removed, and my throat was so sore that I could scarcely swallow. A different doctor walked in and introduced himself as Dr. Gates, the neurosurgeon who had operated on me. He stated that doctors had placed 2 metal rods and 6 screws in my spine to stabilize the shattered vertebrae and remove some bone fragments that were putting pressure on my spinal cord. He stated that the procedure went well, but the quantity of edema discovered was alarming and suggested considerable stress to the cord. When I inquired if I'd be able to walk again, he replied it was too early to say, and we'd find out more over the following several days when the swelling subsided. He performed some neurological tests, similar to what the paramedic had done, and asked me to move my legs and feet. I could move my left leg slightly, but my right leg still didn't respond correctly. Dr. Gates took notes and stated that we would continue to watch closely and begin physical therapy as soon as feasible. Dad entered after the doctor had left and attempted to touch my hand, but I jerked away. He looked hurt and asked what was wrong, and I simply stared at him until he sat down and stopped attempting to touch me. I spent the following 2 days in the ICU, where they monitored my spine and treated my pain with drugs that made things feel fuzzy and distant. Dad came to see me every day and attempted to talk to me, but I had nothing to say. Rachel arrived once, remained for about 8 minutes, and then departed, stating she needed to take care of something at home. On the 3rd day, they transferred me to a regular hospital room, and a physical therapist arrived to test my mobility. She assisted me in attempting to sit up in bed, but the action caused my back to scream in pain despite the drugs. We focused on tiny motions such as lifting my legs and flexing my feet, and while my left side was improving, my right side remained considerably damaged. The therapist stated this was somewhat positive since it indicated that the nerves were not fully injured, but rather significantly inflamed due to the swelling. She stated that rehabilitation will be a lengthy process requiring rigorous physical treatment, maybe lasting months. The term months struck me like a physical blow since I had hoped to recover from this in a few weeks. On day 4, Dad brought my little sister Lily to see me, and she burst into tears when she saw all of the tubes and monitors attached to me. She was only 7 years old and had no idea what had happened, other than that I had fallen and injured my back. I attempted to grin and assure her everything was okay, but my voice came out weak and unconvincing. Lily inquired when I'd be home, and I had to tell her I didn't know yet. Dad grabbed her aside and explained my spine damage and operation in simple words. Lily wondered whether it would be like when Granny fractured her hip and required a walker, and Dad mentioned it may be something like that, but we hoped I would heal more completely. After they departed, I laid in bed looking at the ceiling and reflecting about all I might no longer be able to accomplish. I was set to join varsity soccer in the autumn and had been training all summer. Now I couldn't move across the room without assistance. A social worker came to speak with me about the options that would be available once I was discharged, and she highlighted home health care, adapted equipment, and outpatient rehab. All of these factors made my new world seem more permanent and terrible. The police arrived on day 5 to obtain a statement regarding what had occurred. A detective called Harris sat in my room with a notepad, asking me to recount the events of the afternoon. I mentioned helping Rachel with the ladder and the fall, as well as how long it took before someone dialed 112. When I reached the section when they decided to transport me to urgent care instead, Detective Harris stopped writing and asked me to repeat it. I told how Rachel didn't want to miss her book group and convinced Dad to drive me to the clinic rather than calling an ambulance. The detective inquired if I had clearly expressed that I couldn't move my legs properly and was in terrible agony, to which I said yes. I'd been weeping and begged them to dial 112. He wrote everything down and said he needed to speak with my father and stepmother as well. After he departed, a nurse informed me that delaying medical attention for a kid and relocating someone with a suspected spinal injury against medical advice may be deemed criminal negligence. The prospect that my father would face legal penalties for prioritizing Rachel's social event over my safety struck me with a complex combination of joy and anguish. Dad returned later that evening, and I could tell he had spoken with the police because his eyes were red and his voice was unsteady. He knelt down next to my bed and attempted to apologize again, claiming he had made a terrible mistake and was not thinking straight. I asked him how it was possible to not think clearly while your child was laying on the floor, unable to move their legs, and he had no response. He kept repeating. Rachel had persuaded him that it wasn't as terrible as it appeared, and that he trusted her judgment because she had worked as a medical receptionist years before. I pointed out that a medical receptionist should know better than to postpone dialing 112 for a spine injury, and Dad simply placed his head in his hands. When I questioned him whether Rachel's book club was truly more important than my ability to walk, he burst into tears and said, "Of course not." However, his behavior that day plainly showed otherwise, and no amount of tears could undo what had happened or heal the damage to my spine. He ultimately went when visiting hours ended, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the incessant beeping of monitors. Dr. Gates arrived the next morning with revised test results. He stated the swelling in my spinal cord was decreasing, which was fantastic news, but there was indications of what he called a contusion on the cord. He explained that this was essentially a bruise on my spinal cord caused by the original blow and the pressure from swelling. The contusion may heal over time or cause chronic nerve damage, and we wouldn't know for weeks or months. When I inquired regarding percentages or probabilities, he responded that each spinal cord injury was unique, and he couldn't offer me specific numbers. He did add that the fact that I had movement and feeling in both legs was a good indication, and that vigorous physical treatment would offer me the best chance of a full recovery. The physical therapist returned that afternoon, and we worked on sitting at the side of the bed with my feet on the floor. My back ached from just being in that posture, and my legs shook from the exertion of carrying so much weight. She indicated we'd work our way up to standing with help and eventually walking with a walker. My mother traveled up from Arizona on day 6, and the expression on her face as she entered into my hospital room made me cry. She had divorced Dad when I was 4 years old and moved away for business, but we had maintained a good relationship through video talks and holiday visits. She hurried to my bedside and hugged me gingerly, avoiding all the tubes and cables, before asking what had occurred. I told her everything from the start and saw her face go from concern to incredulity to rage. When I reached to the section when Dad and Rachel decided to drive me to urgent care, Mom rose up and exited the room. I could hear Mom in the hallway having a heated conversation with Dad, and while I couldn't make out all she said, I did hear her label him criminally negligent and an unsuitable father. When she returned, she was plainly upset, but she was attempting to keep it under control for my sake. She requested to meet it with my physicians and obtained extensive information about my condition and prognosis, asking questions that Dad apparently had not thought to ask. She then called a lawyer who specializes in medical malpractice and child welfare matters, claiming that what Dad and Rachel had done constituted complete neglect. Laura Evans, a lawyer, visited the hospital 2 days later and interrogated me about what had transpired. She documented everything with my approval, taking precise notes on the timing and what was said. She stated that delaying emergency medical attention for a youngster with an evident significant injury might result in child endangerment charges, and that the delay in my situation had directly led to poor consequences. She stated the urgent care facility had paperwork of when we arrived, and what the receptionist and nurse had said about calling 112 right away, which corroborated my description of events. Laura stated that she would file a complaint with Child Protective Services and investigate whether there were grounds for illegal action based on my injuries. Mom inquired whether there was any possibility to prevent Dad from having custody of Lily in light of what had occurred, and Laura responded that it would be determined by the findings of CPS inquiry. The thought of Lily still living in that house with Dad and Rachel, where a book club meeting had taken precedence over my spine, made me sick with concern. Physical therapy increased during my second week in the hospital. The therapist, Nena, was supportive but realistic about how difficult rehabilitation would be. We practiced standing with a walker while Nena supported the majority of my weight, and even that little attempt left me fatigued and in agony. My right leg remained substantially weaker than my left and would not bear weight correctly, dragging slightly when I attempted to move it. According to Nena, this asymmetry is typical with spinal cord injuries, and vigorous therapy should eventually restore more balanced function. We did the standing exercise twice a day, regardless of how painful it was, since Nena emphasized that the sooner we started my neurons firing and my muscles moving, the better my long-term prognosis would be. Between therapy appointments, I primarily lay in bed, alternating between gazing at my phone and dozing, unable to concentrate on TV or literature, because my mind kept repeating that day and all the times when alternative decisions might have altered everything. On day 10, CPS showed up to have a private interview with me. Gerald Finch, the caseworker, had gentle eyes, but asked straightforward questions about my life with Dad and Rachel. He wanted to know whether there had been any other incidents of negligence, or if Rachel had ever mistreated me before the accident. I told him how Rachel frequently made comments about my being clumsy or theatrical, and how she had persuaded Dad that I had been exaggerating several minor injuries during the previous year. Gerald documented everything and stated that he would do separate interviews with Dad, Rachel, and Lily. He inquired whether I felt secure returning to Dad's place once I was discharged. I responded, honestly, I didn't know. The thought of living under the same roof as someone who'd been willing to let me potentially become paralyzed rather than miss a social engagement was terrifying, but I also didn't want to be separated from Lily, who'd already been through our parents' divorce and didn't need more instability. Gerald stated that he recognized the complexities of the situation and that his objective was to assure the safety of all children in the house and that their needs were first. Mom began making plans to take prolonged leave from her job so that she could stay in town while I recovered. She secured a short-term rental apartment near the hospital and told me that once I was discharged, I would remain with her rather than return to Dad's house. Dad attempted to argue about custody arrangements, but Mom's lawyer cut him off swiftly, pointing out that his recent decisions about my medical care provided her grounds to file for emergency custody modification. Dr. Gates cleared me for discharge on day 14, with orders to attend extensive outpatient physical therapy 3 days a week. The hospital arranged for a wheelchair because I couldn't move more than a few steps with the walker, and Nana gave Mom explicit instructions for assisting me with exercises at home. Walking out of the hospital in a wheelchair after being brought in on a stretcher seemed unreal, as if I were seeing someone else's life rather than living my own. Mom pushed me to a rental car and helped me get into the passenger seat, which took many minutes and left both of us fatigued. Mom had explicitly requested that the rental flat be tiny, furnished, and on the ground floor with no stairs. She had already purchased a shower chair, placed grab bars in the bathroom, and fitted up one of the bedrooms with a leased hospital bed. The degree of preparation she'd done in just a few days demonstrated how seriously Mom was taking my care, emphasizing the contrast with Dad's decisions. That first night in the apartment, I attempted to shower with Mom's aid and ended up weeping from a combination of pain, frustration, and embarrassment at requiring assistance with basic cleanliness. Mom simply hugged me as I wept, telling me that we'd get through it together and that it was acceptable to be unhappy, terrified, and furious over what had occurred. She assisted me into bed after that, and I fell asleep almost immediately, fatigued as I had never been before. Physical treatment began the next day at a 15-minute distant outpatient facility, and my mother had to assist me in transferring from the wheelchair to the car, then from the car to another wheelchair at the clinic. Russell, my physical therapist at the outpatient clinic, had evidently dealt with a large number of spinal cord injury patients. He thoroughly assessed my abilities and limitations, assessing my strength, range of motion, and reflexes in both legs. My right leg remained considerably affected with diminished reflexes and problems with voluntary movement, but my left leg was around 60% of normal function. Russell devised a therapy plan that would focus on regaining strength and retraining my nervous system to communicate correctly with my muscles. The exercises were tiring and difficult, involving resistance bands, balancing training, and attempting to walk between parallel bars while Russell held my weight. After an hour, I was drenched in perspiration and almost in tears, and Russell thought I did well for my first session. I couldn't imagine doing this 3 days a week for months, but Russell claimed consistency was essential for recuperation, and skipping sessions would drastically delay my development. Mom took me back to my apartment where I promptly dropped into bed and slept for 2 hours. Dad began phoning and messaging me often requesting to see me, but I disregarded the majority of his attempts. Mom was communicating with him through her lawyer about custody and medical expenditures. The hospital expenses were already above $150,000, with additional costs from the operation and continued rehabilitation. Dad's insurance would pay a portion of it, but there would be hefty out-of-pocket expenses. Laura Evans was arguing that Dad and Rachel should be held financially accountable for those charges due to their irresponsibility. After 2 weeks, CPS concluded that Dad acted irresponsibly, endangering my health and welfare. They required parenting seminars and monthly house visits if he wanted to keep custody of Lily, and they placed our case on a monitoring list. Gerald Finch phoned to inform me of the results, saying that while they couldn't press criminal charges, their findings may be utilized in custody procedures and civil litigation. The fact that an official agency had acknowledged Dad's wrongdoing seemed significant, even if it couldn't reverse the harm to my spine. My 15th birthday passed without celebration as I was in the midst of regular treatment. Mom cooked a tiny cake, which we ate in the flat, and Lily brought over a card she had created. Dad dropped her off and attempted to enter, but Mom barred the door and told him he was not welcome. Lily hugged me tightly and murmured that she missed me and wanted I'd come home, but I had to explain that I couldn't return to Dad's house just now. She didn't understand and began weeping, and Dad had to come get her while she was still angry, making me feel awful, even though none of this was my fault. After they went, Mom and I discussed long-term plans, and she mentioned that she was considering permanently shifting to a post in this city so that we could be together while I recovered. The prospect of starting fresh at a new school in a wheelchair filled me with fear. However, remaining at Dad's place was not an option, so this appeared to be the lesser of two evils. Physical treatment progress was frustratingly sluggish. After 4 weeks, I could walk small distances with a walker, but my right leg continued to drag, and I experienced persistent lower back discomfort. Russell stated, "This was a substantial improvement given the severity of my injuries, but it didn't seem like it when I couldn't walk or stand for more than a few minutes. The imbalance in my legs was progressively improving with my right side regaining function, but Russell warned that it would never be totally equal to my left." He also stated that I would most likely have back pain for the rest of my life and would need to exercise caution when performing certain activities. The idea that this injury would have a long-term impact on me, that I'd never take simple movement for granted again, hit me at unexpected times and made me want to scream. I began visiting a therapist named Dr. Kim to help me process the trauma, rage, and sadness. And she helped me understand that everything I was experiencing was perfectly acceptable and reasonable given what had occurred. Laura Evans filed a civil lawsuit against Dad and Rachel 2 months after my injury, alleging negligence and child endangerment. The complaint claimed reimbursement for medical bills, future treatment costs, pain and suffering, and possible long-term impairment. Dad's lawyer sought to claim that it was a good faith judgment decision, but Laura had documents from the urgent care facility that said, "I needed emergency care immediately." The paramedics report noting the dangerous delay, and Dr. Gates' testimony that the delay had most likely worsened my outcome. Rachel hired her own lawyer, separate from Dad's, and attempted to claim she'd deferred to Dad's judgment as the parent, but Laura had my detailed account of Rachel convincing Dad to delay calling 112. The legal procedure was tedious and stressful, with depositions, document demands, and continuous back and forth between attorneys. Meanwhile, I was still going to physical therapy 3 days a week and gradually regaining function. But Russell informed me that my development would likely plateau before I recovered completely. I turned 16 at physical therapy, doing leg lifts with resistance bands as my mother sat in the waiting room. Russell brought in a cupcake with a candle and sung Happy Birthday, and I sobbed because this was not how I had envisioned spending the year of my life. I expected to be playing varsity soccer, learning to drive, and applying to universities rather than relearning how to walk, coping with chronic pain, and suing my own father. After 6 months, the lawsuit was resolved out of court with Dad's insurance company agreeing to pay a considerable sum to cover all of my medical expenditures, as well as additional compensation for my injuries. Rachel's insurance also helped, albeit her lawyer negotiated a lower sum. The money didn't alter anything about my spine, my daily suffering, or the lifelong limits I now faced, but it meant I wouldn't be buried in medical debt for the rest of my life. Laura stated that the payment was actually rather significant and represented how awful Dad and Rachel's actions had been, that the insurance companies decided it was cheaper to settle rather than face a jury trial in which the facts would make Dad and Rachel appear even worse. Physical treatment eventually moved to 2 days each week. Then, as Russell mentioned, I had reached a plateau in my rehabilitation. I could walk without using assistance aids, but I still had a perceptible limp, decreased feeling in my right foot, and chronic lower back discomfort that required daily medication. Russell stated, "I had made excellent progress despite the severity of my injuries and the delay in treatment, but I had never regained complete normal function. Activities I enjoyed before the injury, such as soccer and jogging, were now nearly difficult to do without risking more spinal injury." Russell assisted me in identifying modified sports such as swimming and some forms of cycling that I could safely participate in. But things weren't the same. Dr. Kim helped me work through the pain of losing my pre-injury life and talents, and I gradually began to embrace this new version of myself. Mom made her transfer permanent, and we got a proper apartment to live in. I enrolled in the local high school for my junior year. Dad and I ultimately began having monitored talks at Dr. Kim's office with the goal of repairing our relationship. He'd finished the CPS-mandated parenting seminars and appeared sincerely sorry, but I wasn't sure I could ever totally trust him again. The realization that he had chosen Rachel's social function above potentially sparing me from serious damage caused a rift in our relationship that I didn't think could be totally mended. Lily came to stay with Mom and me on weekends, and we gradually reestablished our sisterly relationship in a new setting. She inquired about my limp scars and why I couldn't do certain things anymore, and I attempted to respond honestly in an age-appropriate way. Dad and Rachel split 6 months after my injury, with Dad admitting she had a negative impact on his judgment and parenting. I wasn't sure if that was factual or a handy tale. However, Lily would no longer be living with Rachel. Despite missing large amounts of time for medical checkups and therapy, I graduated from high school with good honors 1 year later. My limp was less evident, but still noticeable, and I had to take pauses to sit down throughout the graduation ceremony, since standing for too long pained my back. Mom sobbed as they called my name, and I went across the platform, presumably recalling a moment when I wasn't sure whether I'd ever walk again. Dad was also there, sitting a few seats back. When I established eye contact with him, he gave a sad grin and a little wave. I waved back, acknowledging, but not forgiving. Because certain things cannot be forgiven, even if you understand that they were the result of weakness rather than malicious intent. I'd learned to live with my altered physique, constant agony, and the realization that one person's selfish decision had irrevocably ruined my life, and I'd learned that the people who are meant to protect you may fail spectacularly and devastatingly. All you can do is live and rebuild from the damage they left behind.